8 months and more than 100 interviews into the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation into Russia's interference in our election, the committee heads announced today there's a long way to go.
It's safe to say that the inquiry has expanded slightly. Initial interviews and document review generated hundreds of additional requests on our part for information. It identified many leads that expanded our initial inquiry. The committee continues to look into all evidence to see if there was any hint of collusion.
The committee leaders say there are still a lot of documents that need to go through on that subject, and they're also looking into the more than 3,000 Russian-linked ads that were turned over by Facebook. As you probably know, CNN reported today that several of those ads specifically targeted Michigan and Wisconsin, which were crucial swing states, which Donald Trump won by less than 1% in November. The relationship, or whatever it is, between Trump and Vladimir Putin has been at the center of a lot of questions over the past year. Plus, joining me now is a woman who has written extensively about both men. Masha Gessen is a journalist, activist, New York Times bestselling author, born in Russia, came to America as a teenager. Her latest book is The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, was just named as a National Book Award finalist for nonfiction. Masha, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I know you don't think the Putin administration is wildly competent, but are they competent enough to direct an ad campaign at Michigan and Wisconsin in key parts of the state?
Okay, so that CNN report actually said
Yeah.
that a minority of the ads that were bought by Russian companies were geographically targeted.
Oh, that's
and of
right.
those, a small number were targeted in Michigan and Wisconsin.
But there were still two states that had the smallest margins of victory, 10,000
Yeah,
and
but we
22,000.
don't know what states other...
I'm not asking you if it changed the outcome of the election.
No,
I'm asking you if the Putin people are...
What I'm saying is that we don't actually... that I think the headline on the CNN story was wildly misleading. That at this point we don't know that Russians actually specifically targeted Wisconsin and Michigan as opposed to the other 48 states, or whether they targeted them among other 48 states. And in addition, yes, Russians are certainly competent enough to know what every other person who is politically engaged in this country knows, which was that there are certain states that are more important than other states, and Wisconsin and Michigan are among them.
Meaning, I assume what's implied in that second statement of yours, and that they wouldn't need to collude with people in the Trump campaign to figure out what those...
Do
you think they did, based on your knowledge of the Putin people and Putin and people on this side?
I think we don't know. I think we need to wait for the results of the Mueller investigation.
We do. In your book, you trace the evolution of Russia from hopes of democracy to what you call a mafia state. Do you see parallels between the early days of Putin and the early days of Donald Trump here?
I don't. I don't see parallels between the early days of one and the other. I see parallels in some of their psychological appeal, and I think those parallels are really important.
What are they?
Well, they both appeal to the imaginary past. They both speak to a population that feels destabilized, disoriented, like if the future has been sort of taken away, that certainty is no longer there where it used to be. It's a very vulnerable population. A kind of population, or a large number of people in this population, want to hand over their agency to someone who will just say, okay, I'll take charge.
You said today on the radio that one parallel between the two of them were they both lied. They both were liars. Am I not correct about that?
Oh, you're absolutely right. But there are particular kinds of liars.
But I want you to tell me what they are. But based on the reading of your book, the lying of Vladimir Putin hasn't hurt his popularity with the people of Russia. Well, one would argue the lying or something of Donald Trump has suppressed his numbers dramatically, no?
Well, first of all, we don't really know whether his numbers have been suppressed dramatically, and second of all, we don't know what suppressed the numbers.
How can you say they have? I mean, they're much lower than the percentage of the electorate.
No, there have actually
mid-30s, low 40s.
There have been pretty contradictory polls, and when we're looking at people who actually voted for Trump, the fluctuation there isn't nearly as impressive as we'd like it to be.
So you think actually he may have sustained virtually the same level of support that he had on November 8th?
That's what some of the polls look like.
I don't know any poll than Rasmussen that says that, but I take your word for it.
But the point is, even if, let's assume that his numbers have been vastly decreased, we have no idea what did that. Nor would I call what Putin has popularity. Russians actually don't have a choice.
Well,
it's not like there's...
Well, what do you mean when you say they don't have a choice? I don't mean in terms of election results. I thought I read in the late part of your book that despite the fact the negative impacts of Putin-esque policies on the people of Russia, that when they're polled about how they feel about their leader, they rate him pretty high. Am I not? Is that not correct?
They are polled, and what I actually write about, the reason that totalitarianism is in the subtitle of the book, is that I write about the fact that when people are actually deprived of their ability to form opinions, when the public sphere has been completely destroyed, it's not opinion that we're getting, and it's not the public that we're polling, right? I mean, it's true that those numbers are produced, but I think they actually take the temperature of totalitarianism in society rather than tell us how much people love Vladimir Putin.
What's the term you just used? The public sphere being destroyed? Is that what you said? Is the public sphere being destroyed here in the United States in the 9 months that we've had Donald Trump?
I think it's been damaged. I think it's incredibly resilient. I mean, I think that's we have to also understand, in addition to what kind of danger we're in, I think we're in extreme danger, I think we also have to understand what we have, right? We have the most robust civil society of any society in the history of the world. We have probably the healthiest public sphere of any country in the world right now.
But doesn't it get far less healthy when one of the things that Donald Trump has successfully sowed, even though the numbers are starting to reverse, is trust in the media? I mean, people in large numbers have bought this fake news notion, and ultimately a serious number of them end up in places that don't crack their minds open, that essentially agree with their worldview, and if anything, just reinforce that worldview. Doesn't that do great damage to that?
Absolutely. I mean, we're having a little bit of a glass half full, glass half empty conversation, right? So where I think it's full, and I think that this is important, that a majority of people in this country are still routinely exposed to opinions that they don't share. Right? A minority, a very large minority, actually a sufficiently large minority to possibly elect a president, are really and truly locked in a bubble of conspiracy thinking and falsehoods and never exposed to things that really challenge it. But a majority aren't.
Can we get back to Vladimir Putin for a second? You're probably the only person who's either watching this show or here who has actually sat together with Vladimir Putin. You told us today that you met with him after you wrote The Man Without a Face, a book about Vladimir Putin, which apparently he didn't even know about, or at least suggested you did. What did you learn about the man in that personal one-to-one encounter that you didn't know about him when you wrote about him?
Well, you know, I mean, this was like having a character from my book come alive and talk to me. And so part of me was kind of hoping that he would actually turn out to be more human and more charming than I knew him to be from having studied him and having studied every video of him speaking. You know, he's not a man of a large public record. This was actually possible to do, like listen to every interview he's ever given. And he was very predictable. He was very wooden, very sort of two-dimensional. He used to have a reputation as a charmer. And I think he's either lost it or it was an exaggerated reputation. I think he has lost it because he is in a dictator's bubble. By the time I met him, he had been in power for 12 years. And, you know, he cracked sort of below-the-belt jokes with me. He called himself something that I can't call him on the air here in this country. And I think he was trying to ingratiate himself to me that way, which was, I mean, he just was pitching himself all wrong, but it's like he only has one tune left.
You've written great things about him and our own president. Very nice to see you, Masha. Thank you so much. Good luck with your book.
Thank you for having me.
The book, again, is The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia.